Hello, my name is Destin Keys, and I am playing the role of the Scholar. Those in favor of labeling genetically modified foods often cite the importance of communicating information to the public and the consumer's right to know. In theory, the consumer may then make an informed choice that is consistent with their value system. However, Costefont and others found that increasing consumer perception of genetic modification through labeling did not change preconceived attitudes towards GM food, instead observing that those who supported GM food before supported it even more strongly, and those against GM food opposed it more vociferously. Magnuson and Hursty offered a solution in favor of genetic modification by suggesting that consumer attitudes towards GM products could become more positive if there was a clear health or environmental benefit directly associated with the modification. Yet this public acceptance would hinge on the specific benefit being supported and the labeling authority. According to a consumer survey by Rowe and Teisel, the most credible label would be a no-GM label certified by the FDA that included contact information where people could obtain more information about the product. This scheme would theoretically provide the most transparency to the consumer, while GM labeling would ultimately crowd already cluttered labels and be lost among the other information. During the past 20 years, countries around the world have developed labeling requirements for genetically modified foods. If you look at the map here, you'll see the green countries are those who have passed legislation. Countries that require mandatory labeling include Australia, New Zealand, the EU, and Japan, all of which are importers of non-labeled American foods. This has caused significant problems with U.S. exports, particularly when the presence of genetically modified genes are found in non-GM crops. Some believe that the solution to this problem is to label genetically modified crops in the U.S., but this presents many associated challenges in itself. One of the main issues with GM labeling is that there is no international standard, and the likelihood of one developing is vanishingly remote. The appropriate tolerance level for genetically modified genes in foods varies by country, but the EU has enacted such strict standards that current methods cannot accurately identify the genetically modified material, especially for highly processed foods where much of the DNA is broken down. There is no one particular label scheme or authority between countries, thus increasing industry and consumer confusion. Another negative consequence of mandatory labeling is the economic cost associated with modifying existing packaging and the perceived consumer effects, which is inherently linked with the consumer choice issue. Pro-labeling supporters argue that mandatory labeling would increase consumer choice in the marketplace, but research shows that this does not seem to be the case. It has been demonstrated in both the EU and Japan that as soon as foods were labeled as genetically modified, they were pulled from the shelves. Processors found it cheaper to source non-GM ingredients at a higher cost than pay the even higher expenditure of redesigning and repackaging. They also feared potential adverse connotations in consumer acceptability, as studies have demonstrated that GM labels are regarded negatively by the consumer. Lusk and others suggested that for labeling to become a viable option, segregation costs between GM and non-GM foods would have to be decreased significantly, or there would need to be a substantial public outcry at the amount of GM products in foods. At this point in time, the public outcry would be the more likely option, as personal ethics have become the heart of the GM debate. Many people believe that genetic modification is unnatural, or that there may be unintended effects of digesting genetically modified food. These beliefs have a large sway when shared by a significant portion of the population, as was seen in the recent debate surrounding GM labeling in Oregon State. The conclusion is that labeling of genetically modified foods is not feasible at this time and may not be feasible until market conditions change dramatically. These market conditions include increased consumer demand for labeling and acceptance of the costs associated with repackaging. However, if consumers demand labeling and subsequently do not buy the products, then the only reason to label would be to boycott GM food and get it pulled from the shelves. To best evaluate the population's opinion, consumer and industry surveys should be conducted by the FDA every 5 years to gauge labeling perceptions. Consumer demand should be coupled with an update of policy laws to ensure a smooth transition, if perceptions towards GM labeling appear to become a more viable option. And here are my references.